That's Rod Serling introducing an episode of The Twilight Zone more than half a century ago. Starting tomorrow, the show is back.
Imagine a television show so ahead of its time that its own network was afraid of it. Not afraid in the way studios fear bad ratings or poor reviews. Afraid in the way people are afraid of mirrors that show too much. Afraid of what the audience might see when they looked closely enough. That was The Twilight Zone. And for one particular episode, that fear was so overwhelming that the people in charge did something remarkable. They didn't edit it. They didn't water it down. They simply made it disappear. For 55 years, one episode of one of the most celebrated television programs in American history was kept from public view. Not because it was poorly made, not because it was technically deficient or dramatically weak, but because it told an uncomfortable truth at a moment when America was not prepared to hear it. The episode was called The Encounter, and its story, both on screen and off, is one of the most fascinating, troubling, and ultimately important chapters in the entire history of broadcast television. This is the story of how a 25-minute drama filmed in a single attic became too dangerous to show, and why, after more than half a century, it finally found its way back to the audience it was always meant to reach. To understand why The Encounter was banned, you first need to understand the man who created it and the era that shaped him. Rod Serling was not a typical television writer. He was a World War II veteran who had served in the Pacific Theater as a paratrooper with the 511th Airborne Division. He witnessed death up close, not dramatized, not filtered through the safety of a camera lens, but real and immediate and permanent. When he came home, he did what many veterans of his generation did. He tried to move forward, but unlike most, he also tried to make sense of what he had seen by turning it into stories. Serling broke into live television in the early 1950s, and he was almost immediately recognized as a major talent. His scripts were sharp, psychologically rich, and morally serious in a way that much of television at the time simply was not. But ambition and the television industry of the 1950s were not always compatible. Network executives were cautious. Sponsors were even more cautious. The goal was to sell products to as many households as possible, and anything that might alienate a segment of the audience, anything controversial, politically charged, or emotionally demanding, was seen as a commercial liability. Serling learned this lesson the hard way in 1956 when he wrote a live television drama called Noon on Doomsday, intended as a fictional response to the murder of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old black boy who was brutally killed in Mississippi in 1955 after his murderers were acquitted by an all-white jury. Serling's script was an act of moral outrage, but by the time it reached the screen, network executives and sponsors had gutted it so thoroughly that the core of the story, its racial dimension, its connection to a real injustice, had been surgically removed. The victim was changed to a vaguely described foreigner. The setting was shifted away from the American South. The point of the entire drama had been amputated. Serling was furious, and from that fury, an idea began to grow. If he couldn't say things directly, he would say them indirectly. If the censors were watching the front door, he would come in through the back. He would use science fiction, fantasy, allegory, the strange, the surreal, the speculative, as a vehicle for social commentary that no sponsor could easily identify and no executive could easily suppress. He would hide his critiques in plain sight, wrapped in stories about robots and time travel and creatures from other dimensions. And in October of 1959, that idea became The Twilight Zone. The show premiered on CBS and was immediately unlike anything else on television. Each week brought a completely self-contained story with a new cast, a new setting, and a new moral dilemma. There were no heroes who returned the following week, no comfort of continuity, just one strange story after another, each one using the language of the fantastic to speak about something entirely real. Nuclear anxiety, conformity, racism, the human capacity for cruelty, the fragility of identity, the price of cowardice. Serling wrote or co-wrote the majority of the episodes and narrated all of them, delivering his signature introductions and closing remarks in a voice that was both calm and deeply unsettling. He had a gift for making the ordinary feel sinister and the extraordinary feel inevitable. And for 5 seasons, he used that gift to push American television into territory it had never dared to enter. But even the Twilight Zone had limits. And in the spring of 1964, during the show's fifth and final season, one episode pushed past all of them. The encounter aired on May 1st, 1964. It was one of only a handful of episodes in the entire series to take place in a single location with just two characters, a format known in the industry as a bottle episode. The minimalism was partly a budget decision. The show's fifth season was being produced under significant financial constraint, but the confined setting also served a deeper dramatic purpose. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to look away. The story opens in a cramped attic. A World War II veteran named Fenton, played by Neville Brand, is going through old boxes and discarded belongings. In the process, he comes across a samurai sword, a trophy he brought back from the Pacific after the war. Shortly afterward, a young Japanese-American man named Arthur Takamori appears at the door, looking for odd jobs. Fenton, in a gesture of casual generosity, invites him up. He offers him a beer. They start to talk. What follows is one of the most psychologically intense pieces of drama in the history of American television. The conversation between Fenton and Arthur begins casually enough. Two men from different generations and different backgrounds, sharing a drink in a dusty attic. But beneath the surface, something is already shifting. The sword sits in the corner. Both men keep glancing at it. And slowly, as the beer flows and the afternoon wears on, the masks begin to slip. Fenton starts talking about the war. Not with pride exactly, but with a kind of compulsive need. The way veterans sometimes return to their worst memories, not because they want to, but because they can't stop. He talks about killing Japanese soldiers. He talks about how he came to own the sword. And in the telling, something ugly begins to surface. Guilt. Shame. The particular horror of a man who knows he may have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Arthur, meanwhile, grows increasingly difficult to read. He is polite, then tense, then strangely intense. And then he says something that changes the entire atmosphere of the scene. He reveals that his real name is Taro, and he confesses, or claims to confess, that his father was a spy for Imperial Japan, that his father helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. The attic tightens like a trap. From this moment forward, the episode becomes something harder to categorize. Is Arthur telling the truth? Is he testing Fenton? Is he working through something he was told as a child? Some terrible family secret passed down like an heirloom? Or is he speaking in a kind of metaphorical language, using the idea of his father's betrayal to articulate something about what it means to be Japanese American in a country that looked at people like him and saw an enemy? The episode never answers these questions. It refuses to. Instead, it lets the ambiguity curdle and expand until the two men are no longer having a conversation, but fighting a war of their own. Quiet, verbal, then something much worse. The sword, which Arthur insists carries a spiritual force of its own, becomes the center of gravity for everything unspoken between them. Whether you read it as literally haunted or as a symbol of inherited violence, the brutality of war being passed from one person to another, from one generation to the next. Its presence dominates the final act. The episode ends in bloodshed. There's no redemption. There's no lesson neatly delivered. There's only the attic, the sword, and two men who could not find a way out. When the encounter aired, the reaction was immediate and hostile. Viewer complaints poured into CBS. Critics were divided, but the loudest voices were those calling the episode dangerous and irresponsible. Asian American advocacy groups objected specifically to the portrayal of Arthur's father as a traitor, a detail that, they argued, reinforced exactly the kind of racial suspicion that had been used to justify one of the most shameful episodes in American domestic history. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to consider the context. It was 1964. Less than 20 years had passed since the end of World War II, and in the intervening decades, the United States government had done almost nothing to reckon honestly with what it had done to its own Japanese American citizens in the years following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Beginning in 1942, more than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the west coast of the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and incarcerated in internment camps spread across remote and inhospitable parts of the country. The vast majority of these people were American citizens. They had committed no crimes. They were given no trials. They were given almost no notice. Families packed what they could carry and were transported, under military guard, to camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The justification offered by the government was national security. The reality, as documented extensively in the decades since, was that there was no credible evidence of widespread disloyalty among Japanese Americans. The internment was driven by racial paranoia, wartime hysteria, and long-standing anti-Asian prejudice that had deep roots in American society long before Pearl Harbor. In 1964, when the encounter aired, none of this had been officially acknowledged. The government had not apologized. No reparations had been offered. The people who had been imprisoned were expected to move forward quietly and be grateful for the country that had wronged them. In that environment, an episode of a popular television show that depicted a Japanese-American man confessing to a connection to Pearl Harbor, even fictionally, even ambiguously, felt to many in the community like a wound being deliberately reopened. CBS did not defend the episode. There was no press statement, no public conversation about the artistic merits of what Sorling had created. The network simply pulled the encounter from syndication. When the show entered reruns, when it was packaged for cable, when it moved to home video, the episode was not included. For most viewers, it ceased to exist. For the fans who knew about it, it became something between a rumor and a legend, passed along in hushed tones, circulated in grainy bootleg recordings, debated in early internet forums with the intensity that only lost media inspires. George Takei, who played Arthur in the episode and who would go on to become famous worldwide for his role as Hikaru Sulu in Star Trek, rarely discussed it in the years immediately after its broadcast. But he had lived the history it depicted. As a child of 5 years old, he and his family were removed from their home in Los Angeles and sent to internment camps, first in Arkansas, then in California. He had memories of soldiers with guns, of his parents trying to shield him from the reality of what was happening, of the bewildering experience of being labeled an enemy in the only country he had ever known. Those memories would shape the rest of his life, eventually making him one of the most outspoken advocates for civil rights, historical memory, and the importance of confronting the past honestly. For 55 years, the encounter existed at the margins. And then, in 2016, something changed. The Sci-Fi Channel, which had acquired the rights to broadcast a full Twilight Zone marathon over New Year's Eve, made an announcement that stunned longtime fans of the series. They would be airing the encounter in its original, unedited form, for the first time since May 1st, 1964. No disclaimers added, no scenes removed. The episode, exactly as Sorling and his collaborators had made it, inserted into the marathon as though the intervening half-century had simply not happened. The response was extraordinary. Viewers who had only ever heard of the episode's existence watched it for the first time and were shaken by its rawness and its relevance. Critics who revisited it found themselves reconsidering the original objections, not dismissing them, but seeing them in a more complex light. And in the years since, as the encounter has become more widely available and more widely discussed, a clearer picture has emerged of what Sorling was actually trying to do. He was not trying to slander Japanese Americans. He was not endorsing the logic of internment. What he was doing, in the way he always worked, was forcing two very different kinds of shame into a room together and refusing to let either one off the hook. Fenton's guilt is the guilt of a soldier who may have committed atrocities and chosen to call them valor. Arthur's shame is the shame of a person who has internalized the hatred his country directed at him, who has absorbed the accusation of disloyalty so deeply that he begins, on some level, to repeat it. Neither man can free himself. Neither man can free the other. The attic becomes a sealed chamber of unprocessed history, and the sword, the literal artifact of violence carried home from a war, becomes the symbol of everything neither of them is able to put down. That reading doesn't resolve every criticism of the episode. The decision to make Arthur's father a genuine traitor, even within the ambiguous framework of the drama, remains legitimately controversial. It is possible to acknowledge the episode's power and complexity while also acknowledging that it caused real pain to a community that had already suffered enormously. Both things can be true. That tension, the tension between artistic courage and the harm that even well-intentioned art can cause, is part of what makes the encounter such a rich and difficult object to reckon with. But reckoning with it is exactly the point. The episode's return is not a simple act of restoration. It is an invitation to have a conversation that was shut down in 1964, a conversation about war and memory, about racial guilt and racial trauma, about the stories a nation tells about itself, and the stories it suppresses because they are too uncomfortable to tell. The encounter was not the only episode of The Twilight Zone to be suppressed. It was simply the most famous. Over the years, several other episodes were pulled from syndication, held back from home releases, or simply forgotten. And each one tells a slightly different story about the forces that shape what audiences are allowed to see. Miniature, which starred a young Robert Duvall as a lonely man who becomes fixated on a museum dollhouse he believes is inhabited by living figures, disappeared for decades not because of its content, but because of a copyright dispute. The writer's estate had licensed the story for a single broadcast, and CBS had failed to secure long-term rights. A small legal technicality erased a genuinely haunting piece of work from public view for the better part of 40 years. A short drink from a certain fountain, a dark and bittersweet story about an aging man who takes an experimental youth serum at his young wife's insistence, was pulled because of concerns that the plot resembled an unproduced script submitted by another writer. Whether or not the resemblance was intentional, the legal risk was enough. The episode vanished. It eventually reappeared in some home video editions, but its absence from the main syndication package meant that generations of viewers never encountered it. Sounds and Silences, an episode following a man whose obsession with loud noise eventually inverts into a torturous hypersensitivity, was pulled after a lawsuit. A former military officer claimed the story was based on his life and had been used without his consent. CBS, rather than fight the claim, simply stopped airing the episode. And then there is an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, perhaps the most unusual entry in the entire Twilight Zone catalog. This episode was not written by Sorling or produced by his team. It was a French short film directed by Robert Enrico, adapted from a short story by the American writer Ambrose Bierce, which CBS purchased and aired as a standalone episode in 1964. The film follows a Confederate sympathizer about to be executed who seems to escape, only for the final moments to reveal that everything after the rope dropped was a dying man's last hallucination. It is a masterpiece of narrative structure and emotional devastation. It also won the Academy Award for Best Short Film the same year it aired, and CBS was only licensed to broadcast it once. After that single airing, it was gone, known only to those lucky enough to have seen it live, or to encounter it later in the obscure corners of home video distribution. What connects all of these lost episodes is a simple, sobering truth. Art does not survive on its own. It survives when the institutions that control it choose to preserve it. And those institutions make their choices based on a complicated mixture of legal, financial, and cultural factors that have very little to do with artistic merit. The Twilight Zone's buried episodes were not buried because they failed. They were buried because they were inconvenient. Inconvenient to sponsors, to lawyers, to network executives, to a public that preferred its television to be more comfortable than honest.